Oil wealth flooded Iran in 1973, yet informal lenders tightened their grip on Tehran's credit rather than losing it. In a single year, the country's oil income soared from $4.6 billion to $17.8 billion. This massive influx of cash appeared to rescue the economy, giving the Shah the means to bankroll modernization projects and wipe out budget shortfalls. Visible wealth seemed ready to anchor the regime's authority. By the end of this video, how a fourfold surge in oil wealth left informal lenders still controlling most of Tehran's credit will make sense. Even so, robust growth obscured a basic flaw in the system. The oil windfall poured into factories, sprawling highways, and lucrative military deals with the West. New manufacturing plants opened. Construction crews crowded Tehran's streets. Modern glass and steel towers began to dominate the skyline, hinting at global ambition. Despite this, inflation climbed past 20% each year, undermining real incomes. Wages increased on paper. In practice, however, families could buy less than before. Money rarely traveled in a simple path here. The bazaar operated more on trust and kinship than on formal banking, cycling credit between established guilds. Now, government blueprints called for state-run markets and broad, paved avenues. Fast food chains and franchises appeared, reflecting a westernized version of commerce. Shopkeepers in the old bazaars watched their premises targeted for demolition as banks spread branches across new shopping malls. Banks offered loans at rates the bazaar network had never needed to formalize, but that interest rate gap stayed unresolved. Despite repeated warnings, development outpaced the nation's ability to build needed infrastructure. The government inked deals for nuclear plants, telecom systems, and chemical facilities, but rising prices strained every budget line. Foreign experts arrived in droves, earning far more than local professionals. Luxury items filled store shelves, catering to elites and new managers. Villagers streamed into Tehran, chasing jobs on construction sites. The city's population ballooned, overwhelming housing and utilities. Shantytowns mushroomed at the margins, yet oil money barely reached the poor. With a stroke of the pen, leaders could erase the past. Centuries of religious tradition vanished as Iran's official calendar shifted to honor ancient monarchy. Religious leaders, merchants, and families who used the lunar calendar found themselves estranged. University graduates in engineering, law, and economics poured into a saturated job market. Those with royal connections snapped up the best opportunities. Frustrated youth built ties with groups already sidelined by the state. But the bazaar's stability masked pressures that had no outlet and no resolution. For generations, Tehran's economic heart beat in guild-run stalls, where trust and family ties determined who received credit. Instead of assets, a merchant's reputation served as collateral. Informal lenders charged annual rates between 12% and 18%, but the Shah's new banks promised loans at half that cost. State officials viewed the bazaar's credit system as outdated and inefficient. Merchants, on the other hand, saw modernization as a threat to their survival. They believed the new financial order would either bend to their realities or falter in trying. The ability to offer collateral dictated who could access funds. Spice traders, whose promises were respected by fellow merchants, found their word dismissed by bankers trained in the capital's new academies. Only paperwork that met official standards mattered to these institutions. Without the right documents, access to capital vanished, except through the very networks the state intended to replace. Promises of economic growth often come with strings attached. Government lenders advertised loans at 6 to 8%, but required proof of assets, documentation most small vendors didn't have. As a result, many kept paying steep premiums to informal brokers who knew their families. The availability of cheaper credit turned out to be largely theoretical. On paper, state banks offered better rates, but in practice, traditional networks continued to dominate because policy implementation lagged far behind. The bazaar's role in political activism was well established. Merchants had closed their shops in 1954 to protest Western oil deals, and again in 1963, after manipulated elections increased the Shah's grip on power. Leaders of the guilds realized that their financial independence fueled their ability to oppose the regime. Yet, as Tehran's population swelled with migrants from the countryside, demand for affordable goods and small loans grew as well. Each newcomer reinforced the relevance of the bazaar's old networks, even as government institutions tried to contain their influence. Modernization planners viewed the bazaar as an obstacle. They saw traditional merchants as slow to change, untaxed, and more interested in hoarding gold than investing in public works. SAVAK, the government's secret police, instilled fear by executing those suspected of dissent, making opposition an extremely dangerous choice. Shutting down the bazaar would have crippled Tehran's supply chains. The government faced a dilemma. It depended on the bazaar's distribution power, but could not tolerate its financial independence. By 1972, the government's banks had expanded their reach and reduced official lending rates, achieving every modernization goal on paper. The real effects, however, diverged sharply from official expectations. Merchants left out of formal banking paid even more to informal lenders, squeezing their profits and increasing their vulnerability. This economic strain led to political unrest. Working with thinner margins made merchants easier targets for state interference. Greater vulnerability fueled their support for opposition groups, promising to restore the old guild freedoms. Despite this, the government still failed to recognize the cycle it had set in motion. Choosing to borrow from traditional networks instead of state banks became an act of resistance. Informal lenders still provided around 40% of Tehran's retail credit, even as new bank branches opened everywhere. Infrastructure designed to replace the bazaar was in place, and yet, most incentives led merchants to stick with the old system. The gap persisted, but what it would produce had not yet been decided. Cities took the first blow, where swelling populations overwhelmed infrastructure and public services that had no plan for what came next. Rural laborers surged into Tehran, Tabriz, and Isfahan at a rate that far exceeded government expectations. From 1966 to 1976, nearly 2.8 million people left their farming communities for jobs in construction, factories, or day labor in the growing service sector. The Shah's planners highlighted these migration numbers in optimistic 5-year plans. But within a year and a half, the result was a full-blown housing emergency. Local governments simply could not zone new areas or install sewers fast enough to keep up. Building permits lagged behind the flood of newcomers. Part of this failure was by design, not just by mistake, but nobody had predicted which system would falter first. No formal survey could properly account for the population boom. Social infrastructure quickly buckled under the pressure. Health clinics built for 15,000 now faced crowds of 60,000. Schools ran triple shifts, with teachers rotating in and out every 4 hours. Meanwhile, a growing divide separated the government's promises of modernization from what the new urban poor actually experienced. That gap could be measured in numbers, but the true cost was still unknown. Wages in the cities jumped ahead of those in factories almost overnight. Factory pay increased by 8 to 12% during this time. Drawn by higher pay, healthy men from rural backgrounds kept arriving, even though the jobs they found rarely lasted long. Major roads were completed. Apartment complexes reached their full height. Still, these migrants stayed, taking out loans just to survive between jobs. By 1976, inflation soared to 25% each year, causing paychecks to lose value faster than contractors could offer raises. On paper, incomes looked better, but in reality, people's spending power was already shrinking. Many rural newcomers had borrowed money from relatives to finance their move. Now, they turned to bazaar moneylenders for loans to pay rent, buy food, and send money home. Traditional lenders charged between 15 and 30% interest. Official documents were irrelevant. Instead, loans depended on personal knowledge of the borrower's family, hometown, and reputation. Households found themselves trapped by rising debt and shrinking budgets, and yet the authorities were preparing to make things even harder. Government-backed banks appeared in working-class neighborhoods, promising loans at rates between 6 and 8%. However, getting a loan required tax forms, proof of employment, and something valuable as collateral. Most migrants lacked any of these documents, even so. Lenders in the bazaar never asked for such paperwork, trusting instead in personal networks the state could never match. A Treasury bureaucrat overseeing the new banking initiative saw the gap between official and bazaar interest rates as a flaw to be fixed. For migrant laborers, that same gap could mean whether their children ate this month or went hungry. What officials called progress, the workers already had their own word for. Between 1973 and 1978, Iran's Planning and Budget Organization invested $2.8 billion in new university buildings. Campuses and student housing multiplied fourfold across the country. Student numbers climbed sharply, from 67,000 in 1968 to 75,000 by 1977. That represents a staggering 265% rise in less than 10 years. Construction deadlines were met, and classrooms filled each fall. Even so, the swelling student population quickly overwhelmed the new facilities. Administrators tracked each building's completion and monitored enrollment statistics closely. What no one had anticipated, however, was the fate of these graduates after commencement. Industrial jobs, in contrast, grew at just 4% per year during this period. Money was funneled into showpiece infrastructure at the expense of factories and workshops. These were the very places that could have hired new graduates. Steelworks and cement factories held grand opening ceremonies, but received little funding to run at full capacity. Universities were producing diplomas non-stop. Yet, no new system was in place to absorb this influx of educated workers. Imagine a factory that keeps churning out goods, with nowhere to store them. The excess builds up until the system buckles. Graduates faced an increasingly crowded and competitive job market. Recruitment campaigns had promised careers in government ministries and the oil sector. Graduation events featured speeches about national progress and guaranteed employment. Yet, each jobless graduate now stood for wasted public investment and lost future tax income. Pressure mounted on state support programs, which the government struggled to expand. The math was straightforward. The political consequences, however, were ignored. Exclusion became necessary for progress, at least in the eyes of officials. They portrayed secularization as proof of modernity meant to impress Western investors. Every year, about 12,000 women were pushed out, many from families whose sons also sat at home with degrees and no job. These families had paid tuition, missed out on wages, and expected government jobs in return. Instead, they received rejection on ideological grounds, and a graduate whose education held little value outside of the state's own networks now closed to them. Ahmadzader, the Shah's final prime minister, later blamed the breakdown on a clash between borrowed Western reforms and Iran's long-standing guild traditions. Universities had expanded the granting of degrees, but had not transformed the broader economy to reward or need those qualifications. Diplomas became common, but private employers kept hiring through family ties and old apprenticeship routes, unchanged since the Qajar dynasty. Government spending on education soared by 22% a year. State hiring, though, increased by just 6%. Every fiscal quarter, the gap widened, and yet by 1977, the mismatch had become structural, not cyclical. By 1978, Tehran alone was home to around 80,000 university-educated young men with no stable work. Traditional commercial networks, rooted in family and apprenticeship, could neither employ nor ignore this swelling group. Shia clerics, whose religious schools had been pushed aside by state universities, now reached out to these alienated graduates. Mosques offered acceptance and a sense of belonging without any conditions attached. Young men joined not because they rejected modern ideas, but because modernization had promised them opportunities that never materialized. Shia custom established a 40-day period of mourning, known as the Chechalom, to honor martyrs. After SAVAK's deadly crackdown on protesters in January 1978, this ritual began to shape events. Mourners assembled again 40 days after the first killings, only for the regime's forces to open fire once more. The calendar's rhythm now dictated the pace of unrest. Tax income vanished rapidly during the 6th week of each mourning cycle. Bazaar traders didn't close their shops just once. Instead, they staged repeated closures, all timed with a religious observance. Every closure lasted 3 to 5 days. Each time, government revenue dropped by 12 to 18%. Confidence among merchants and shoppers crumbled as the crisis deepened. Shopkeepers trusted regular customers enough to offer credit. Guild leaders settled disputes fairly. When a mourning cycle led to a strike, this entire network of trust and credit halted. Customers couldn't settle their debts because shops were shuttered. Merchants, cut off from income, failed to pay their suppliers. State-controlled licensing boards took over many guild functions between 1963 and 1975. These boards demanded payments, inspections, and approvals, all handled through official channels. However, these bureaucratic systems could not replace the personal trust that kept informal credit alive. Strikes left the formal apparatus without solutions. Banks insisted on collateral, something traditional guilds had never needed. Oil wealth had tightened bazaar credit, and merchants faced worsening cash shortages, while state income shrank in predictable bursts. Formal bank interest rates stayed around 6%, but bazaar moneylenders demanded between 15 and 20% for quick loans during strikes. Merchants who borrowed to keep paying workers during one closure faced steeper rates when the next shutdown arrived. Each 40-day interval made the financial strain even worse. By August 1978, the Chehalom had repeated 6 cycles. The bazaar districts had lost 40% of their revenue compared to the previous year. State tax collection in those areas collapsed alongside. Customs duties remained steady since oil exports continued throughout the morning, but taxes from local commerce, directly linked to the bazaar, plummeted. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, forced into exile since 1964, sent out cassette speeches that found their way into mosques and the backrooms of the bazaar. These recordings didn't speak in vague revolutionary slogans. Instead, they addressed specific merchant complaints, unpredictable fees, foreign banks undermining traditional credit, and savings diminished by inflation. The Chehalom transformed these complaints into a regular rallying cry, ensuring the message came back every 40 days. Economic pressure quickly turned symbolic anger into actual hardship, intensifying the cycle already set in motion by the Chehalom. In 1977, oil revenues no longer grew at their previous pace. The Shah faced a crucial choice: allow rising prices or enforce spending cuts. Jamshid Amuzegir stepped in as prime minister, tasked with cooling down the economy, controlling inflation, and tightening government finances. Many historians see the austerity plan that followed as a mistake. Treasury records tell a more complex story. The policy actually achieved its financial aims, but also set in motion events that would eventually dismantle the regime. What looked like progress in financial reports spelled disaster elsewhere. Economic downturns often hit the poor hardest. Migrant laborers suffered most. They had flocked to Tehran, seeking paychecks far higher than what they could get back home. Those extra earnings disappeared almost immediately. The city's promise of opportunity collapsed into anxiety and deprivation. Returning to their villages was not an option. No jobs awaited them there. Joblessness surged even as prices stabilized. Inflation and unemployment moved in opposite directions, but only inflation numbers were highlighted in official statements. This contrast draws attention to which statistics leaders choose to emphasize publicly. Suddenly, cash flow dried up everywhere. Amuzegir's spending cuts reduced government contracts, so state-connected developers had less cash to hand out. Guilds could not provide loans to members struggling with rent or stock shortages. The bazaar's credit system depended on trust and short-term repayment cycles. When money stopped circulating, those trust-based networks started to crumble. The guild's weaknesses became more visible as financial support evaporated. The government had no effective way to monitor the growing pressure within merchant circles it had tried for years to undermine. Inflation fell sharply, from 30% to below 10% in a year and a half, just as Amuzegir had promised. The Shah could point to steady bread prices as proof his modernization project remained sound. However, officials focused so much on financial data that they overlooked a new alliance forming among those hurt by austerity: construction workers out of jobs, merchants squeezed by shrinking credit, and graduates unable to find employment. Each group felt abandoned after years of economic optimism. their separate struggles started to merge into a shared sense of injustice. Mosques became the only place where people could get help without government oversight. Religious leaders handed out charity to families forced out of informal housing. Shopkeepers received interest-free loans when they couldn't restock shelves. Mosques provided space for workers to organize support networks. Economic hardship turned these religious spaces into centers of practical resistance. Prayers now took place alongside secret planning meetings. Security agencies tracked these changes, but usually misunderstood them as purely religious opposition, not as economic distress finding an outlet. Officials recorded what was said in sermons, but ignored the flow of loans. Mosque attendance was labeled religious radicalism, while loans changed hands and resistance networks formed nearby. By focusing on beliefs and not the actual support systems, authorities overlooked the infrastructure of resistance growing right in front of them. This misjudgment would have consequences they were not prepared to handle. By 1978, SAVAK, the Shah's intelligence and internal security agency, operated with a yearly budget estimated between 100 and 150 million. That sum represented about 1% of Iran's total state spending. All of those funds were dedicated solely to surveilling, intimidating, and crushing opposition. Budget reports made the allocation visible, but few outside the Ministry of Finance understood what had been sacrificed to make room for it. The agency's scrutiny was relentless. SAVAK employed around 5,000 officers. A vast web of informants infiltrated universities, workplaces, and religious spaces. Each quarter, finance officials observed surveillance expenditures climbing, and the reality was simple. Money funneled to intelligence work could not also be used for the subsidies that kept food affordable. As unrest intensified, the Shah's government began to feel the strain. By mid-1978, SAVAK's expenses rose by 12% each quarter, while government funds for subsidies diminished. The system, engineered to dismantle secretive opposition groups, was unable to counter widespread strikes erupting in 17 cities at once. Budget limits forced the regime into a stark dilemma: feed the people or focus on controlling them. SAVAK's advantage was its ability to infiltrate small circles. Agents tracked meeting places, eavesdropped on messages, and targeted leaders before resistance could spread. Mass strikes and citywide demonstrations, however, played by different rules. No spy could stop thousands of oil workers abandoning their posts together at sunrise. Confronting large crowds required force, not surveillance. Attempting to retrain intelligence officers for riot control would take months the regime no longer had. When more security personnel were sent to industrial hubs, fewer remained for the bazaars, where merchants were increasingly joining the protests. As opposition expanded geographically, the cost to contain it grew at the same pace. Authorities had assumed, in planning for 1979, that unrest would stay isolated and sporadic, manageable through selective arrests and disappearances. That expectation unraveled in September 1978, leaving financial forecasts instantly obsolete. Black Friday, on September 8th, changed everything. Troops fired on protesters in Tehran's Jala Square, killing dozens. Cities that had been quiet for months erupted in protest. Clearing the square achieved its tactical objective, yet it also triggered a cost spiral the treasury could not absorb. After this, every protest demanded sending in troops ahead of time, and each deployment risked making things worse. The regime's approach, detect trouble early, neutralize it discreetly, and avoid visible violence, was upended by mass demonstrations. Now, public force was unavoidable. This shift drained resources much faster than any previous estimate. In 1977, SAVAK spent an average of $2,000 for each arrest, including detention and interrogation. By October 1978, detention centers were overflowing. It took weeks to process new detainees. The cost per arrest soared beyond $5,000. As the pace of arrests increased, the system grew even more overloaded. The earlier decision to criminalize opposition had already set the stage for dissidents to overwhelm any security structure designed to contain them. On March 2, 1975, Iran's era of competitive politics abruptly ended. The Shah issued an order that eliminated all political parties overnight. Only the Rostakas party remained as the single legal avenue for political engagement. Anyone in government or at universities was required to join the party. Those seeking public contracts faced the same compulsion. Economic complaints could not be voiced through official channels without coming into direct conflict with the authorities. Speaking out now meant exposing oneself to severe personal risk. As institutional constraints increased, choices dwindled for professionals. Dissent from within the establishment quickly vanished. Participation in the formal economy now required holding a party membership card. Many people quietly accepted this new reality. Guilds lost their autonomy, and with it, economic flexibility dried up. While Rostakas took over their administrative roles, it did not inherit their capacity to adjust prices. Guild members once negotiated for better margins during Ramadan or secured loans for harvests. This authority disappeared once party officials, who lacked commercial interests, assumed control. Their ability to influence policy simply vanished. Interest rates began climbing right away. State banks, now overseen by party loyalists rather than merchant advocates, increased short-term business loan rates in cities from 9% to 14% between 1975 and 1977. Shopkeepers turned to informal lenders at even steeper rates, sometimes as high as 22%. These escalating rates reflected not only greater uncertainty, but also the loss of reliable, traditional credit channels. For smaller traders, squeezed profit margins slipped below what was needed to survive. Staying afloat now meant sinking deeper into debt. Under the single-party regime, decisions about public spending became entirely opaque. There were no independent parliamentary committees left to scrutinize ministries. Oil revenues soared, reaching $20 billion each year by 1976. Ordinary Iranians witnessed only vague project announcements and rising prices. The real destination of the funds became unknowable. Faculty members who declined Rostakas affiliation lost research grants and the right to attend international conferences. Student organizations were shut down, only to reappear as youth arms of the party. Universities had once offered a degree of protection, allowing economic criticism to circulate in academic journals and seminars without immediate state retaliation. That safeguard disappeared. With these restrictions, campuses grew more tightly monitored and controlled by external authorities. Academic conversations now had career-threatening consequences. The drive for organizational unity created a dangerous lack of information. No entity remained to communicate issues like shrinking merchant margins, stagnant industrial wages, or rising graduate unemployment without attracting accusations of disloyalty. Ministries compiled the data. Access was strictly limited, widening the gap between policy and reality. Those with control over budgets failed to see the warning signs as urgent or actionable. Signals of distress had nowhere to go. By 1977, Rostakas' membership rolls had swelled to 5 million. Internal party files reported no economic complaints. Members who voiced concerns risked being expelled, which would mean losing their economic lifeline. Under these conditions, silence became a rational choice, even as inflation reduced buying power and debt overwhelmed families. The system projected an image of total satisfaction, while discontent built up out of sight. The Shah retained ultimate control over spending, arms purchases, and industrial subsidies. He designed the structure to concentrate all authority and eliminate alternative power bases. Centralization worked flawlessly. Yet the system could not tolerate its own isolation. If this changed how it lands, share your view below. The accounting continues.